Welcome to the CAREcast.
Hello and welcome to the CAREcast. This week I'm joined by my colleague James Mildred. James is Head of Communications at CARE. James, could you just tell us a little bit about yourself and how long you've been working for CARE for?
Yeah, hi Naomi, great to be with you. Weird to be this way round. Normally I'm hosting a podcast and now I'm appearing as a guest on podcast, so slightly strange. This is actually the first time I've been a guest on a podcast in my entire life, so who knows what's about to happen, but I'm excited. So I started working for CARE at the end of 2014, to be precise. It was the 8th of November 2014. And I'd just come from working in the Scottish Parliament during the independence referendum of 2014 up there. And I worked for CARE for about 2 years. And then I left and went to a church just north of Bristol in a place called Yate. And I did some training there. And after around about 2 years there, I then came back to CARE in a new role. And I've been at CARE ever since. So in total, I've been at CARE for around about 4 years now.
Goodness me, wow, amazing. So today we're talking about a very sensitive issue, which is very controversial, and that's the topic of assisted suicide. Some people call it assisted dying, can be known as euthanasia. So this is a topic that I know that you feel particularly strongly about. And I think one of the first times I met you, you said that this was the issue that really grabs your heart. So could you just tell us a little bit about how you became really interested in this topic and why it's such an important issue for you?
Yeah, I mean, I think for me, it's a funny one because I don't think it was ever a conscious thing when I didn't join CARE off the back of feeling particularly strongly about this issue. I hadn't been aware of many of the debates that took place in Scotland when I was living there. For example, while I was at university, there were debates around changing the law in respect to assisted suicide. I don't remember being particularly affected by those debates, but I think when I came to CARE and quite quickly was involved in some court cases that were happening and giving comment on them to the media, for example, and also there was within, I think, less than a year of starting work at CARE, there was a very significant vote that took place in September 2015. And I think on the Rob Marris assisted dying bill, it was the last major attempt at Westminster to change the law in England and Wales. And I think I just found that it was something that I could speak about with particular passion and clarity. I remember going up to Derby, for example, to a church husting style thing to persuade the MP there whether or not she should vote. Which she wasn't sure which way she was going to vote, and I was there to represent the argument saying don't vote for Rob Marris's bill, and someone from Dignity in Dying was there to say do vote for it. And I just love the opportunity to articulate why it is so important that we care for people towards the end of their life, and why the push for legalizing assisted suicide or assisted killing is really driven by an incredibly individualistic ideology. And as a Christian, as someone who believes that community and common good, and that we are all made in the image of God, we're all individuals, we're all autonomous to a degree, but nevertheless the decisions that we make have ripple effects that have consequences for others around about us. I actually came to the view, I think it was there instinctively already, but I was able to articulate it and learn new ways of articulating it, that the Christian viewpoint, I believe, is to say no to assisted suicide. And that is a better position, a better story for people who experience suffering at the end of their lives. And I do wonder if part of my interest in this is because I have a dad who is older than most people my age dads would be.
Very diplomatically put.
That was very. You have no idea how many times I've had this in my life. Essentially, when I was at school, I'd go around friends' houses. Their parents would say when my dad came to pick me up, James, your granddad's here to pick you up. So that gives you an idea of where we're at with this. And I do wonder if that contributed at all to it. And I was always struck by the fact that when you looked at the evidence, wherever you see assisted suicide or euthanasia legalized, what you see as a result is rising case numbers and also this idea that people choose it because they're afraid of being a burden on others. And I remember ghostwriting a piece for CARE's chief exec, Nola Leach, and it was in response to a former Archbishop of Canterbury, Lord Carey. And Lord Carey had come out in favour of assisted dying, as it was called, back in 2015. And in the piece, I argued that being a burden is actually how we are made. God has made us dependent. From the moment we're born, we're dependent upon others for sustenance, food, for being looked after, for care. It's why when babies are abandoned, it's so brutal, because it's a violation of the instinctive way things should be, which is that we should care for a baby because a baby is vulnerable. And it was in this piece I tried to persuade Nola to call Lord Carey the high priest of assisted suicide, but unfortunately she vetoed that line. In hindsight, was probably a good move. But I think that concept of being a burden as a positive is a uniquely Christian concept, and it's something that I think Christianity can speak into this debate. That our response to intense suffering at the end of life is not to view it as something to be avoided or run from or scared of, but rather to approach it with a desire to help that person, to carry that burden for them, to share in their suffering. I think that is uniquely Christian. Parable of the Good Samaritan would be a good example. I just think that's a better story. And that's quite apart from all of the very powerful medical reasons why I don't think we should be giving doctors the legal power to kill patients under any circumstances. So that's a very long-winded way of saying that was sort of my journey into this issue. And I've spoken in the media about it a number of times. I've written pieces about it, and over the years my conviction has grown stronger, not weaker.
It's wonderful hearing you talk about this, because it's clear that you have a very strong conviction, sort of theologically. You really understand the theological arguments, but also the political and the medical arguments, as you say. And later on, we're going to be talking a bit about some of the main arguments people use in favor of assisted suicide and how we can counter those and know how to respond as Christians. But just finally, you mentioned the Maris Bill in 2015, and of course you were working for CARE at the time. Can you tell us a bit about what that was like, this kind of great victory where the law was this attempt to change the law was resoundingly defeated? What was that like at the time, being there?
It was the first major campaign that I was involved in. It was a huge learning curve. It was an opportunity to meet with MPs and disability rights campaigners and doctors, medical professionals. It was a huge effort, and CARE was privileged to play a part in the endeavours to resist that bill, but many others also played their part. And it was really fascinating, because we were trying to influence the media, trying to get stories placed in the media from our point of view. That was an uphill battle from day one. You had editors saying, I don't want to publish this piece because I'm worried about the reaction from here, there, and everywhere. And there was a very strong and very powerful lobby that was pushing for this change. But I will never forget the day of the actual vote. So the Rob Maris Assisted Dying Bill number 2, as it was called, because there was at the time an assisted dying bill in the House of Lords. It was a bill that was aiming to legalise physician-assisted suicide for terminally ill patients who had 6 months left to live. And there were a number of safeguards that were so-called safeguards included in the legislation. For example, two doctors had to approve it. And if there was a dispute, judges would get involved. It was something like that. I forget the details now. But in the debate itself, in the second reading debate, it was a Friday, the 11th of September, 2015. One of the really interesting things that happened during that debate was you actually heard MPs stand up, MP after MP after MP from both sides of the House, saying, I came in to the chamber today determined to vote for this bill. But having heard the arguments as to why we should not legalise assisted suicide, I am now going to vote against this bill. And in the end, it was defeated by 330 votes to 118. So it was a significant defeat. And there's one thing that I've taken from that, which is when you take the view, as I do, that we should not legalize assisted suicide or euthanasia. I mean, assisted suicide is euthanasia is awful. I mean, euthanasia is truly, truly horrendous. Assisted suicide is just as bad, but I think in some people's mind it's a milder form of euthanasia. They are in fact distinct, because assisted suicide is where the doctor will provide the medication, but you yourself will have to administer it as the patient. So you yourself will voluntarily, as it were, take the actual drug. So it's an assisted suicide. Whereas euthanasia, the doctor will actually give you the injection, usually him or herself. So there is a distinction. But it did strike me that when we argue against this, that those arguments are in fact more persuasive than we often think or believe, but it's much more difficult to get them out, because they're arguments very much based on logic and very much based upon reason and very much based upon tradition and history. They're arguments that are drawn from not so much emotional individual cases, but more from a common good perspective. So we argue against it from the point of view of saying this is too dangerous, this is too risky, and it can come across very abstract. But when those arguments are presented well, as they were in the 2015 debate, and CARE was able to work with MPs to resource them with the very arguments that they used in that debate, then it can be very, very, very powerful. And that is an encouragement to all of you watching and listening who think this is a lost cause. It's not a lost cause, because when we are able to get the arguments out there, they can carry the day. They did in 2015, and I pray that they'll carry the day again. So the Rob Maher assisted dying bill was the last major parliamentary attempt at Westminster to change the law, and it was overwhelmingly defeated. And we'll have to see what happens in the coming days.
And of course, as you say, that we have challenges coming up across the world. In fact, there are challenges all the time where parliaments are attempting to legalise assisted suicide. Can you just tell us, first of all, what's the law in the UK at the moment? Is there a different law in Great Britain, in Northern Ireland? Could you just tell us what the law is as it stands?
So as ever, because we have devolution, the situation is never simple. But broadly speaking, there's a piece of legislation called the 1961 Suicide Act, and this decriminalised the act of suicide and an attempt to commit suicide. But it put a very strong prohibition on assisting someone to commit suicide or encouraging someone to commit suicide, and that applies in England and Wales and in Northern Ireland as well. The law in Scotland is a bit different in that it's not technically illegal. However, there's no case law from which to kind of demonstrate the illegality of it. But there are, within Scots law, a number of very clear prohibitions. So murder, culpable homicide, for example, that you would think if there was an incident, if there was a case, that they would apply. And that's why, for example, as far as campaigners are concerned, they still want to try and change the law in Scotland to introduce assisted suicide. And it's just really interesting. In 2015, we also saw an assisted suicide bill in the Scottish Parliament defeated by 82 votes to 36. So there's 129 MSPs in the Scottish Parliament, so obviously lower numbers than down at Westminster. And they called it an assisted suicide bill, whereas down in Westminster, they called it an assisted dying bill. Let's just be really clear about this. During the evidence session to the committee, Patrick Harvey, the leader or co-leader, as I think he is now, of the Scottish Green Party, had the courage to admit that what they were talking about in Scotland was assisted suicide. And he refused to use the term assisted dying because he, along with those of us who were campaigning against him, agreed that assisted dying is nothing more than a euphemism. It is a deliberate attempt to manipulate language to make something that is truly horrendous sound nicer, easier, simpler, softer, gentler. So don't be fooled. And I would really strongly encourage people out there, do not use the term assisted dying. It is a euphemism. We should instead be using the term assisted suicide or assisted killing, because that is what it is. And that's not me, being deliberately pernickety or whatever. I actually think it's a really important point, because in this debate, perhaps more than any other, language really matters. So that's just a fascinating observation. So at the moment, assisted suicide and euthanasia in all its forms is illegal in England, Wales, and Northern Ireland. And although it's not codified in law in the same way in Scotland, it's not something that happens in Scotland. It's not something that is probably allowed under Scots law. And that's why campaigners are trying to change the law.
So we know that there are a few jurisdictions around the world where it is in fact legal, as well as euthanasia. What do you know about some of those jurisdictions? And you talked about this kind of euphemistic language that's used. I think in Oregon, it's known as the Dignity in Dying Act. Is that right? So yeah. That's often a term that's used. What examples have you seen of how the law's been changed, and how maybe some of those safeguards that have been introduced have changed over time? Could you give some examples of those?
Yeah, no, absolutely. So, for example, Oregon State in America introduced their assisted suicide laws in 1997. And since then, we've seen rising numbers, exponentially rising numbers, and also a significant proportion of patients who choose assisted suicide will put as a determining factor the fact that they were afraid of being a burden upon loved ones, upon hospitals, and so on and so forth. In Washington State, you've had similar laws in place since 2008. You've also seen increases in the number of people taking it up. And again, similarly to Oregon, percentage is high of people who say, I'm afraid of being a burden. And there are a good number of cases in both jurisdictions where people's pain was under control. And that heightens this idea that if you change the law to permit assisted suicide in any form, that it creates a kind of a burden of expectation for some people, that some people would perhaps get to a point where they feel like they should do this because it would be wrong of them not to do it. And that is such a tragic place to end up in, where someone feels like they have to have help to kill themselves, not because they're in unbearable pain, but because they feel like that's their duty. That's terrible. And then Canada introduced a federal law which legalized a form of assisted suicide in 2016. And interestingly, it wasn't that long ago that the Canadian government was making noises that it was actually going to expand the assisted suicide law that applied in Canada. So it was talking about a provision in the original legislation which they suddenly deemed to be sort of not right or fair or unconstitutional. And they basically wanted to get rid of it and water it down. And you see this kind of this mission creep that happens. You see it even more starkly in some of our European neighbours. So Netherlands, for example, euthanasia has been legal since 2002. And one of the really awful things that has taken place in the Netherlands is the way that euthanasia laws have been expanded. So what began as, certain circumstances, euthanasia would apply. Just recently, for example, there were moves to try and legalize it for anyone over the age of 75 who was simply tired of life. So didn't even have to have a terminal illness. And then you also saw recent moves where the Dutch government has said, we are going to change the law so that euthanasia will apply to children aged between 1 and 12. So when the law originally came in 2002, it was 12 plus. But now they want to change that so that between the ages of 1 and 12, if a child has a terminal illness, that they can be euthanized. Cases of people in the Netherlands being euthanized for depression, for anorexia, for blindness. In Belgium as well, euthanasia has been legal since 2002. And again, that has been expanded since it was first introduced to include children of any age. And the numbers have gone up in both of these countries. And there's a culture of death that is created by this, and the relationship between the medical profession and patients is fundamentally been altered. There's a really interesting case that's taking place. There was a man in Belgium, and his mum was euthanized. She had depression, and this man got a call from the hospital, and that was the first he heard about the fact his mum had been killed. And it was the hospital phoning to say, what should we do with her remains? Now, how can we as a civilized society get to a point where that is the way that we are treating human beings? And we we often get accused on our side of the argument of scaremongering, but it is a historical fact that one of the hallmarks of a totalitarian regime, one of the hallmarks of fascism in the 1940s, was that they introduced euthanasia laws to get rid of undesirables. And while it's true to say that the current situation, there are safeguards and there are things that so-called, there are things in place to try and protect from becoming that extreme, look at the way that the laws have been expanded over time. And what you see is eugenics at work. You see this idea that there are certain characteristics, weaknesses, disabilities within human beings that we don't really want because it's affecting our collective gene pool, as it were. And so let's introduce laws under the guise of compassion and dignity that will ultimately get rid of these. And that way we can create a stronger and more, prosperous human race. And this is largely influenced by evolutionary ideology as well. And I'm not someone who has much truck with this because of how influential it has been with eugenics and that whole movement. So again, what you then have to come back to as a Christian is you have to come back to where does a person's dignity come from? Because if my dignity is something that I inherit based upon certain criteria, then yes, you can see the logic of having laws that say, well, you are undesirable because you don't meet the standard for having dignity. This is a very kind of Greco-Roman cultural idea. Way back when you had Greek Empire, Roman Empire, what was the thing they valued? They valued physical strength. That was the great thing in that day. Your value and dignity as a human being was intricately linked to how physically strong and capable you were. And so what that led to was this creation of undesirable peoples and people groups, and they were treated worse than those who were physically desirable. Whereas the Christian worldview doesn't ground your dignity in something that you've inherited. It instead says that you are dignified no matter how strong you are, no matter what sex you are, no matter how many disabilities you might have. You are valuable because from the moment of conception, you're an image bearer of God. And so that the dignity then doesn't come from our own characteristics or our own strength, but it comes from outside of us. And it grounds it in the unchanging character of God himself. And so to assist someone to die before their time has come under God's sovereignty is to violate the dignity that God has given that person. So whether you are in a coma in a hospital bed or whether you are receiving a gold medal at the Olympics, there is no difference in God's eyes between which human being in that scenario is more valuable. Mm-hmm. That is the kind of basis for why, what's happened in Belgium, the Netherlands, Oregon, Washington State, and Canada, in parts of Australia, in Switzerland as well. There's assisted suicide laws there. It is so tragic because it completely undermines the idea that you never stop mattering, that you never stop being valuable, that your human dignity can never be violated. And that's what the Christian worldview teaches. And that is unique and powerful.
So why do you think the issue is getting a lot more support? And we see polling regularly showing that there's quite high support, in fact, for the government in this country to introduce assisted suicide. And we see, like you say, the media are very pro-assisted suicide. Why is there such increasing pressure right now for parliaments and assemblies across the UK to change the law?
I think two things. There are more, but two things. One is that often the way these opinion polls are framed is that the way they're framed is to elicit the emotional response, whereby you're presented with a scenario that is tugs at your heartstrings. And let's be clear that there are instances of genuinely awful suffering at the end of life. This is a broken world. It's a fallen world. Things go wrong, and sometimes they go spectacularly wrong. And those particular cases, there aren't, in the bigger picture, there are not many of them. These aren't happening every single day, every single week. But those cases, when you're presented with them, even myself, as someone who resists assisted suicide and euthanasia, is affected by what I read and what I see. And in that situation, when the majority of people in this country are not coming from a Christian worldview point of view, without that grounding in human dignity based on the character of God, you can see why the opinion poll shows 78, 80% of people in favor of changing the law. And again, it comes back to my earlier point that the arguments that we often employ to do with changing of doctor-patient relationship, it's very abstract, and it doesn't often connect with people in terms of their immediate day-to-day experience. And that's just a huge challenge. But I think, secondly, the reason pressure is growing is because as a society, we have become far more individualistic. And the way that we tend to think, the way that we prioritize things is very much based around the cult of me. So it's sort of a global pandemic of selfishness, if I can put it like that. It's a kind of a collective belief that the only way I can be happy is to have complete and full autonomy. So that's really the idol of our society. My life, my choice, my decisions. It's no real surprise that the most popular song at funerals continues persistently to be Frank Sinatra's My Way. Okay, I mean, it may be number 2 now or number 3, but it's up there. And that's because it seems like as a society, that's what we value. We value independence, self-autonomy. And so you get these mantras, you've got to do what's right for you. And that ideology is very effective because it taps into something that lies in all of us. No one is born not selfish. We're all born naturally, I think, selfish because we're born fallen and we want to be in control of our own lives and our own destinies. And so when faced with the challenge of suffering at the end of life versus a quick fix solution whereby you'll lose your life, but you won't have to go through the suffering, then you can see why people navigate themselves towards that. And when they're then told, we can safeguard it, we can do it well, we can do it properly, we can do it carefully, this is just about compassion, this is just about dignity, you can see the appeal to people. And to kind of speak into that, particularly in a media context, where I think often, sadly, some people in the media don't fully understand the arguments that are going on, is incredibly difficult. So I think that's why you see it growing.
So you've had quite a bit of experience speaking in the media on this particular topic, including some very high-profile campaigners on the side of legalizing assisted suicide. So you've obviously engaged with these arguments a lot. So what would you say to the kind of one of the main arguments is, it's more compassionate to allow someone who is profoundly suffering at the end of their life, they've been given 6 months left to live, and they are really suffering. Why not let that person choose when to end their life, or why not end their suffering? Isn't that more compassionate than letting them suffer a horrible death? Isn't that more dignified? That's a very common argument. How do you normally respond to that?
Yeah, I think the first thing you have to do is you have to acknowledge the reality of suffering. And you have to also acknowledge that in some circumstances, even with the very best of care, it's not always possible to completely alleviate every single symptom, every experience of pain that someone might be going through. I think at the same time, there's both an argument based on that individual's experience, and there's an argument based upon the wider picture. So just taking the argument of that individual who's experienced pain and suffering at the end of their life. What you don't often hear mentioned is that because of the investment and expansion of palliative care, which is end-of-life care, that in the vast majority of cases, it is possible nowadays to control pain and to manage symptoms, to make that suffering less intense and less unbearable. And that is a far more positive thing to invest in, because palliative care doesn't simply seek to treat your symptoms. It also addresses the bigger picture. So for you as an individual, palliative care seeks to address your emotional stresses and pains, your spiritual concerns. It seeks to address the whole person. And the hospice movement, which was pioneered in the UK, we are and continue to be a world leader on this in this respect. And when it is done well, it does give even suffering people genuine dignity. towards the end of their life, and with love and care and respect, and without looking to deny them precious time with their family and closest friends. That's one of the things that I think is so important to say in this debate, that we have to respond to the individualistic narrative by constantly making the argument that no one is an island, that we are part of a continent, as it were, that the decisions and choices we make have ripple effects for particularly our loved ones, our families, our friends. And therefore, we also have to recognize that no one's autonomy is absolute. That in a democratic society, we accept right from the word go that there are limits to my freedom, that if my actions are going to cause harm to another human being, then I should be prohibited from doing that. And if I do it, there should be strong penalties that are applied. And so the idea that, oh, this is just about individual choice is redundant on that basis, because we're talking about giving doctors the legal power to kill patients. And that turns doctors into judges. It puts an enormous burden on them to decide, is this life valuable or not? Are we comfortable with giving doctors that right, that power, that legal backing to do that? And it is absolutely no surprise to me whatsoever that in recent polling of the British Medical Association, which suggested that there's been some movement within the membership of the BMA, although I should say that many, many Christian doctors are not even part of the BMA. So if they were, perhaps that would counterbalance it somewhat. But nevertheless, some movement in favor of some kind of assisted suicide law. But when doctors were asked in that survey, would you be willing to participate yourself in an assisted suicide and active euthanasia, the percentages swung the other way, the majority saying no, absolutely not, don't want to go anywhere near it, kind of thing. And that is no surprise to me at all. So I think we need to be focusing on the benefits of palliative care, which can, in the vast majority of cases, control pain and suffering at the end of life. We don't hear those stories in the media. We don't hear those stories being talked about. And then secondly, we need to look at the bigger picture, which is that changing the law would have dramatic effects for the doctor-patient relationship. It would fundamentally alter the balance of trust. So right now, if my relative is unwell, because the law says the doctors cannot legally help this person to die or kill them, I have confidence to know that the decisions that doctors and nurses are taking are aiming to preserve life, which is the very basis of the Hippocratic Oath, which is this ancient oath that doctors and medical professionals sign up to. So that's one thing. But secondly, we have always made the case that the right to die can very quickly become the duty to die. And you create, as I've talked about before, this culture of expectation whereby, in effect, suddenly economics comes into it. It's much cheaper to kill someone with a terminal illness than it is to care for them, because care costs money, whereas killing them costs a lot less. Now, how can we be absolutely certain that economics will not start coming into the decisions that judges are making? You know, there are some academics who have published studies saying assisted suicide would save the National Health Service money. And as a Christian, as someone who values life and believes that we should not ever treat any human being as an object or base their value just upon their economic ability, I reject that completely. And as a society, that's what we should do. And in these coronavirus times, what we have seen is an instinctive recognition that human contact matters, that we should care for the vulnerable, that we should look after those who are most at risk from this virus. Well, assisted suicide euthanasia just completely cuts against all of that. So there's the kind of common good arguments that we need to have robust protections in place, that hard cases don't make good laws. And then there's the individual argument that palliative care does, and will, in the vast majority of cases, help. No one is trying to say this is perfect. It's a balance. And the current law, which says no to assisted suicide, but offers leniency in the cases of someone who themselves commits suicide, from my perspective, strikes the right balance. And that's why I don't think it should be changed. But look, arguing this, it's an interesting experience in the media, because when you're up against just a sort of a general volunteer, very often they'll come with a personal story and it's very sad. And I just encourage you, if you're ever in that situation, don't belittle them. Like, respond humanly to their experience, try and understand that they may not have arrived at the point of believing in assisted suicide because of some robust, worked out theology, as it were, but rather because what they have seen and witnessed, they never, ever, ever want to see and witness again. And that fear of what they've seen dominates how they then think about it. Just be very sensitive with how we respond to that. It's a different matter when you're debating campaigners who have often never experienced anything like the kind of stories that they love to promote. I think it is important to be more robust in those situations and push back upon sometimes the outrageous things that they end up saying, because they're trying to change the law and they're ideologically motivated, as I must admit am I. So it is just a fascinating experience. In fact, I'll just tell you this, Naomi, the first time I went on TV about this is really bad. I debated the chief executive of Dignity and Dying, the big pro-euthanasia society in the UK. They were formerly known as the Voluntary Euthanasia Society. I debated Sarah Watton on this Victoria Derbyshire show. And it was my first time ever on TV.
Gosh.
I got the call at 9:30 in the morning. 9 o'clock in the morning. I appeared on TV, I think it was about 11. When I got the call, I was actually in a card shop buying a family member, my sister, I think it was, a birthday card. I knew that at my desk. Went back to my desk and had about 15 minutes with one of our policy officers who talked with me and then prayed for me. I walked over to Millbank Studios, just around the corner from CARE's offices, by myself, and I sat in a room. I wasn't in the studio. I eventually discovered that the sound would come from my right-hand side, but at that moment, I actually was convinced that they'd made me look a right mug because they hadn't given me an earpiece, so I thought I wouldn't be able to hear anything. They told me where to look. It was just into a random camera in front of me. And I can only describe what happened next as God's grace and God's mercy. And that when I did hear the sound coming through, I mean, my legs were shaking before this happened. Thankfully, no one could see that. And when the sound did come through, I think God just enabled me to speak slowly, calmly, clearly, without waving my arms around lots, which I tend to do when I speak in any other circumstance. And it was his grace that saw me through that. And I learned from that is something. We have a real problem with people often unwilling to put their head above the parapet and speak out about this issue. But I think sometimes it's because we're understandably afraid. But God's grace, God's ability to empower you in the moment with an infusion of his spirit, as it were. It's probably theologically dodgy, but it's the experience. That's what he does.
Gives you the words, yeah.
Absolutely. I just encourage you to remember that if you're afraid of speaking out on this, because we need people to speak out.
Absolutely. Just touching on something you mentioned about people's fears, and obviously there's this sense of people being very afraid of suffering and of having an undignified end to their lives. But there's also this fear around becoming a burden, or as you said, if somebody in your family was terminally ill, you can now trust that doctors will have their best interests and will look after them to the end of their natural lives. But of course, if assisted suicide were legalized, then that wouldn't be the case. That trust in doctors would be eroded. And you hear all the time people, for example, with disabilities saying that they're afraid of a change to the law. And in Canada, people carry around cards saying, please don't euthanize me. And we've seen horrible stories of people being pressured into assisted suicide in places like Canada. So there's this real fear around the end of life. But a main argument that's also used by campaigners is that you can put these safeguards in place, that if you have all these safeguards, you make sure that the decision that is made is free and voluntary. There's been no coercion, no pressure. You make sure that the illness is terminal, that they've only got 6 months left to live. All of these safeguards are put in place. And people, of course, argue all the time about if there was a change in the law in Great Britain, then those safeguards would be there. How do you respond to that when people make this argument?
Why would we be any different from other countries where they have tried this and where there have been safeguards that have been eroded over time, where the evidence is that people can choose euthanasia or assisted suicide for reasons other than unbearable pain? I think it's a kind of institutional arrogance that we have, whereby we think we can do it better. And sometimes we parachute in experts from other countries to tell us about their experience, who conveniently forget to mention anything about the problems, the difficulties, and the culture that it creates. I mean, what you said there about Canadians carrying around cards saying, please don't euthanize me. I just think that is awful. Like, if that's where we're at, if that's where we're headed, that's so sad that's kind of a fear working in a different direction. There's the fear of suffering, but there's also the fear of doctors killing you because they make the decision and it's taken out of your hands. This isn't scaremongering. This is based on evidence. It's based on reality. Based on the numbers from the Netherlands, one person is euthanized there every 80 minutes. Wow. That's the frequency of it. And so it is a complete culture change that we would be kind of going through if we were to do this. If we were to legalize doctors to kill patients in certain circumstances, I don't think that you could ever create a law that is absolutely bulletproof, that would never see cases of exploitation, of coercion, of abuse, because coercion and abuse, pressure from a family member, for example, it's so difficult to prove that is not happening, because those conversations may happen in private, obviously away from the authorities. And then the patient makes the request the next day, and they don't really want to, but they feel like they have to. How on earth would you police that? How would you properly safeguard against that? I think that's mission impossible. And so the risk, therefore, of legalizing assisted suicide is too much, because we cannot guarantee that the law would work perfectly. The other thing to say, it's a point that I made when I went and spoke at the church in Derby before the MP there, was that the medical science is science. It's not fact always. That means that it's theory. So predictions about how long someone can live with a terminal illness are not always accurate. Sometimes, yes, it's shorter, but actually, I think more often than not, people can live longer than the diagnosis that they're given. People can surprise you. We published something just recently at CARE called Tony's Story. And it features our chief exec, Nola Leach, and she's talking about her husband. They were married for nearly 50 years, and Tony had Alzheimer's for the last 2 years of his life and passed away a few years ago. And there was a moment where he expressed the desire to not go on any longer. He was at a miserable point, lost the use of his legs, incontinent, really, really suffering. But Nola talked about that as just a fleeting moment. He never said that again. And in fact, it wasn't long after that there was a moment before he died where he had clarity of thought and could remember things. And there was like a brief window where Nola said he was the old Tony again. And they would sing, she would sing, he would sing, and her friend was with her as well at the time. They'd sing the song that she walked down the aisle to. They'd sing other favorite hymns that they found on their phone. And then he started laughing because he realized he sounded pretty odd, I guess because his voice had suffered with the Alzheimer's. And so that moment would have been taken away from them both had assisted suicide been something that was an instant response. Something that could be certified quickly and easily by doctors in that situation. And I think we have to recognize that for me, assisted suicide, the arguments for it are an attempt to simplify and give control in one of the messiest and most difficult to control parts of human existence. And I also think that attempt is doomed to fail. And I also think that as Christians, we have a deeper and bigger understanding of the value of suffering. In society, suffering seems to be something to be avoided at every possible cost. Life is about avoiding difficulty and having as much comfort and ease as possible. But I think as a Christian, if I've read the Bible correctly, suffering is something that God uses to do a miraculous work in us. Suffering is something that he takes, and it's an instrument in his hands to do us the ultimate good of making us more like Jesus. We learn lessons in the midst of suffering that we would never otherwise learn. Lessons about dependence on God, our relationship with God goes deeper when we're in the valley of the shadow of death than when we're in the green lands of comfort and ease, kind of thing. And of course, ultimately, suffering was redeemed by the Lord Jesus Christ himself, who suffered in the most unimaginable way when he became that substitute for us on the cross. And he not just physically suffered. I mean, other people since Jesus have suffered in worse physical ways than he suffered on the cross, but it was the spiritual suffering that he went through that was even worse. And I think that we, as Christians, we are never going to be called to suffer to the extent that Christ suffered. And that means that there is always hope. Even in the most awful pain and difficulty, there is always hope. And I think that too is something that the other side, they don't offer any hope, because death is not hope. Death is for someone who doesn't believe in God. Death is the worst thing of all. And so there's an evangelistic part, I think, of this argument from a Christian perspective as well, that we don't want people to be taken before the time that God has appointed, because there are moments, therefore, when they could have listened and heard the gospel of Jesus and responded, and that's been denied them by the fact that they've chosen to end their life prematurely. So it is a really difficult subject. It's really sensitive. I do think that we as Christians have a responsibility to speak out. I mean, think about how much the Bible talks about defending the vulnerable. I dread to think, with a crisis of loneliness that we have, that's only been made worse by coronavirus, the pressure that older people will come under if we change the law. It doesn't even bear thinking. People who live by themselves, who go window to window and never see another human being, who would be tempted, no doubt, if they experience pain, to think, I have no family, I have no friends. What's the point? It just breaks your heart, because that's not how it's supposed to be. And the answer isn't death. The answer is to love our neighbor as we love ourselves, to reach out with compassion and care, and to affirm that person's value and worth. And there's nothing more powerful than when Christians do that for strangers, because it's easier with family and friends. But when you do it for a stranger, when you get alongside a stranger and you say, that person is isolated, alone, bereft of friends and family, and you say to them, I will be your friend, I will be your family. That is the gospel being outworked. And that's a hopeful message for our society. Far more hopeful than assisted suicide.
Yeah, thank you, James. I think you've really outlined there how we as Christians can look at this issue in such a different way, and how we can offer hope to people that we have this better story. We often talk about this at CARE, that we have a better story to tell than those who are campaigning for a change in the law that will allow legalize assisted suicide in Great Britain. So finally, James, how can we be praying? How can we be praying for any upcoming challenges that we might be facing in different parliaments and assemblies across the UK at the moment?
One way that you can pray is we at CARE, we produced this 10 ways to pray for the end of life prayer leaflet. You can find it on our website, care.org.uk/prayer. And then scroll down, you'll find it. That's a good way to get you praying about lots of the different issues that I've talked about, we've discussed together. Pray for MPs and MSPs who believe in the value of life. And pray that they will hold firm. And then secondly, pray for every organization out there that is seeking to campaign against a change in the law, that we would do so with the grace and the wisdom that we need, because we need God's help if we're going to resist the next attempt to try and change the law. And I think finally, just pray that God would burden his church with a greater and deeper desire to speak well into this situation. And I think that it is a topic that we can naturally steer ourselves away from, because we're worried about, different Christians might take different views on that. That's okay. So finally, just pray that the unity of the church will not be broken on this issue, that we'll be able to dialogue well with people who may be more nervous, maybe more influenced by that individualistic ideology. It's gone to the church as well. So we know that it's entirely possible that Christians will take the view that this surely is okay. Let's listen to why they think that, work with them, try to bring them back to those fundamentals of God and creation and dignity. So just pray that we at CARE as well would do that really well and constructively.
Thank you so much. And if you do want to find out about more arguments for or against assisted suicide, we've got some fantastic articles on our website that you can look at, which outline the arguments. We also have a biblical discussion booklet that you can download, which outlines the biblical perspective on the end of life. And we would really encourage you to watch Tony's story, which is this fantastic new video that we've produced, where our chief executive, Nola Leach, talks about her experience of her husband at the end of his life. And you can find that on our YouTube channel. But thank you so much, James, for joining me today on the CAREcast. It's been fantastic having you, and thank you so much for sharing your heart on this issue with us.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
You've been listening to the CAREcast. Remember to subscribe to get the latest episodes and find out more about the work of CARE on care.org.uk. CARE, for what you believe.